Most people think of debt as something personal. A mortgage, a loan, a balance that belongs to an individual and ends, one way or another, with repayment. Governments feel different. Their debts are larger, older, and wrapped in numbers so abstract they seem disconnected from everyday life. National debt is often treated as a technical detail, something permanent, but ultimately harmless. Yet there is a simple fact that rarely gets stated plainly. Almost every country in the world is in debt at the same time. Not just fragile states or developing economies, but the largest and most powerful nations in modern history. The United States, most of Europe, Japan, China, all borrowers, all rolling obligations forward, all operating inside a system where debt is not an exception, but the baseline. This raises a question that sounds almost naive until you take it seriously. If every country is in debt, who is the creditor? At first glance, the answer feels obvious. Governments issue bonds, investors buy them, banks and institutions manage the flow, and markets keep everything moving. It appears orderly, technical, and distant from ordinary life. Something managed by specialists, safely removed from political and social consequences. But debt is never just a number. It is a relationship. And relationships always involve power, even when that power is quiet. To understand who really owns the world, it is not enough to look at balance sheets or interest rates. You have to understand how debt functions as a structure, one that has shaped empires, constrained governments, and survived long after the political systems that created it collapsed. For most of human history, debt was treated with suspicion. Not because lending was immoral, but because its consequences were destabilizing. In ancient societies, owing money was rarely neutral. Debt meant dependence, vulnerability, exposure to forces beyond one's control. When too many people fell into debt, the problem was not individual failure. It was systemic breakdown. This is why early civilizations repeatedly intervened. Rulers canceled debts, redistributed land, and reset obligations not out of generosity, but necessity. Societies in which too much wealth and power accumulated on one side of the ledger eventually became ungovernable. Debt crises did not destroy systems because money disappeared. They destroyed systems because legitimacy collapsed. Over time, something fundamental changed. Debt stopped being treated as a temporary imbalance and became permanent infrastructure. Empires learned how to regulate it, normalize it, and detach it from moral judgment. What had once been explosive became procedural. Interest schedules replaced negotiation. Legal frameworks replaced social limits. Debt did not vanish. It became invisible. The modern world inherited this logic and expanded it to an unprecedented scale. Today, governments do not borrow primarily during emergencies. They borrow as a routine function of governance. Old obligations are refinanced with new ones. Repayment matters less than continuity. The system is not designed to conclude, it is designed to persist. This is where a common misunderstanding takes hold. Many people assume national debt works like a household budget, something that will eventually be paid down through discipline or growth. But sovereign debt is not structured to be eliminated. It is structured to be serviced indefinitely. When a government borrows, it is not promising closure. It is promising stability, predictable interest payments, confidence that the flow will continue uninterrupted. What ultimately backs this promise is not gold or stored assets, but the future capacity of society itself, future taxes, future labor, future compliance. This is why debt is political, even when it is presented as technical. Bond markets do not simply evaluate numbers. They evaluate willingness. Will a government prioritize repayment over social spending? Will it absorb political pain to preserve confidence? When that willingness is questioned, pressure appears almost automatically. Borrowing costs rise, currencies weaken, capital withdraws, and policy space narrows. Adjustment becomes unavoidable. For many people, this remains abstract until it becomes visible. And few decisions made that visibility clearer than what happened in the United States in 1971. Until the early 1970s, the global financial system still rested on an assumption that felt solid. Currencies were linked to the US dollar, and the dollar itself was linked to gold. This did not eliminate debt, but it imposed limits. Borrowing existed, but confidence rested on the idea that money ultimately pointed to something scarce. By the late 1960s, that assumption was under strain. The United States had spent heavily for years, financing war abroad and social programs at home. Dollars flowed out of the country faster than gold flowed in. Foreign governments began to question whether the U.S. could honor its promise to convert dollars into gold. In August 1971, President Richard Nixon announced that the United States would suspend the convertibility of the dollar into gold. Officially, it was described as temporary. In reality, it never ended. With that decision, the global monetary system changed quietly but permanently. Money was no longer anchored to a physical reference. It was anchored to trust in the U.S. government's ability to manage its currency and honor its obligations. The constraint that had limited debt expansion disappeared almost overnight. This shift did not feel dramatic at first. Daily life continued. Markets adapted. New rules were written. But beneath the surface, something essential had changed. The dollar became a fully sovereign currency while remaining at the center of global trade and finance. Other countries continued to hold dollars not because they were convertible, but because there was no viable alternative. From that point on, U.S. government debt behaved differently. It was no longer constrained by reserves. It was constrained by confidence. As long as the world trusted the dollar, the United States could borrow in its own currency, at scale, without facing the same immediate pressures that constrained others. This created an asymmetry that still defines the global system. Countries that borrow in a currency they do not control must earn or acquire that currency to service their debt. Countries that borrow in their own currency do not face this problem in the same way. The United States occupies a unique position within this hierarchy. Its debt is embedded in the system itself. At this point, the idea of a single global creditor begins to dissolve. Power no longer sits neatly with a person or institution. It sits with the architecture that determines whose debt is treated as safe, whose is treated as risky, and whose becomes intolerable. That architecture became visible again after the global financial crisis, most clearly in Greece. In the years leading up to 2008, Greece borrowed heavily, much like other European countries. Cheap credit and low interest rates made debt feel manageable. Greek bonds were treated as safe, nearly interchangeable with those of stronger economies. For a time, the system rewarded that assumption. When the crisis hit, confidence evaporated. Borrowing costs surged. Access to credit collapsed. What followed was not a military intervention or a regime change, but a quieter form of discipline. International institutions, including the International Monetary Fund, stepped in with rescue packages designed to stabilize the system. Those packages came with conditions. Public spending was cut. Wages and pensions were reduced. Essential services were scaled back. Each measure was framed as unavoidable. Greece retained its flag and its elections, but its economic choices narrowed dramatically. Policy became negotiation. The financial system was stabilized. Repayment was preserved. The social cost was absorbed domestically. Unemployment soared. Young people left. Trust eroded. Greece did not lose territory. It lost autonomy over what came first. This pattern was not new. In the 1980s, much of Latin America experienced a similar reckoning. Countries borrowed heavily during years of abundant global liquidity. When interest rates rose and growth slowed, repayment became impossible under existing terms. Assistance arrived with conditions. Spending was cut. Assets were privatized. Entire decades of development were lost. The debt was managed. The system endured. The cost was social. A similar lesson emerged in Asia in the late 1990s. Countries like Thailand, Indonesia, and South Korea were praised as economic success stories until confidence shifted. Capital fled. Currencies collapsed. Debt denominated in foreign currencies became impossible to service. Emergency programs reshaped policy overnight. Sovereignty remained on paper. Constraint defined reality. Across regions and decades, the pattern remained consistent. The system survived. Obligations persisted. Adjustment flowed downward. This is why debt crises are never experienced equally. Governments endure. Financial architecture remains intact. The population absorbs the cost through wages, services, and long-term opportunity. Over time, this creates a quiet inversion of purpose. Governments exist to serve citizens, but debt requires citizens to serve the system. All of this brings us back to the original question. If every country is in debt, who owns the world? Ownership in the modern financial system does not look like conquest. It does not require control of territory or formal rule. It operates through priority, through the ability to decide which obligations must always be honored and which can be deferred. Interest payments are protected. Social commitments are conditional. Stability is non-negotiable. Equality is optional. This does not mean the system is broken. It means it is functioning as designed. Modern debt systems prioritize continuity over fairness and predictability over resilience. They smooth risk at the top by dispersing it downward. They require no conspiracy, only compliance. So the answer is not a nation, a family, or a hidden group. What governs the system is a logic, one in which obligation outlives accountability, and constraints shape behavior more effectively than commands ever could. History shows that systems rarely collapse simply because they are unjust. They collapse when the stories that justify them stop working. When people begin to see debt not as destiny, but as design. Until then, the world is not owned in the traditional sense. It is leased one generation at a time. And the bill is always deferred.